Hello, everyone. Please let me know you are here through Slack, and let me know that you can hear me. Here's the puppy. His ear hasn't stood up yet. Okay. So, today we're going to talk about being a good student. So this is the next lecture in our list. We didn't talk too much about Sophrosyne. We talked about it briefly on the lecture that's entitled Plotinus on Beauty. 1 minute. We discussed it briefly when we did the lecture Plotinus on Beauty, but only briefly, and I just haven't felt like we should go into it yet. Maybe we'll finish with that one. So the next one after that is on being a good student. This is a pretty quick and simple lecture, but it's simple things like this that can easily be overlooked. It's very important. At any stage in the path, even like I've been practicing for 10 years, and I've lived with my teachers for almost half that time. And yet even still, looking at this lecture and quickly reviewing it, my first thought was, this lecture isn't too relevant to me. I don't need to contemplate it too thoroughly. And then immediately after that, I realized how wrong that was, and that I need to contemplate it very thoroughly. It's a simple concept, but it's one that we're constantly overlooking in some way. Even the best students can constantly be overlooking the value of a teacher, because the mind is always trying to find a way to discredit the thing which threatens it. And the thing that's the greatest threat to your mind is your teacher, because your teacher is someone who says he's better than you, right? That's how your animal mind views it, is that your teacher is someone who says, right? A teacher in mathematics is someone who's better at you than math. And if the most important thing to you is spirituality, then the thing your teacher is better at than you is the thing that you care the most about. And if the purpose of spirituality is to perfect the soul and become a better human, then it kind of stands to reason that your teacher is a better human than you and has a more perfect soul. So that's a pretty serious statement to make. And whether you've ever thought it through like that or not, consciously, subconsciously, there's still this deep resentment that can hide of the teacher. And a lot of traditions even have exact terminology for the phase that a student goes through when they decide they hate their teacher, or they want to leave their teacher. I don't remember the Greek name for it, but it translates to, the vision of the evil teacher. And it's very common to have this. So it's important to sit down and really contemplate, because there'll be times in your path where you think things, and some of them will be true. Things like, ultimately I'm my own teacher. And to a degree that's true, right? Because the person that finds the teacher is still you, right? Like if you sought out a teacher, you were the one who had to do that. If you listen to your teacher, you're the one who's listening. If you do what your teacher says, you're the one who's doing what your teacher says. So ultimately, all the burden falls on you. And so there's truth to that, and there's truth to the nature of that contemplation, but it can be very easy to use that to fall into this this slump of feeling like the teacher is of lesser importance than he or she really is. So it's important to really contemplate, I think, two things. One, where you would be without your teacher. It's easy to let the mind make this scenario a little bit rosier than it is. A lot of people, like going through a midlife crisis or something, might think, oh, my life would be better if I wasn't held back by these kids or by this wife or this husband or by these choices I've made. And they think that maybe the grass is greener on some imaginary other side, not realizing that the life they're living is probably the best one they could have lived in a lot of cases. So the same is true when it comes to this. It's important to really try to look at it honestly and thoroughly and contemplate where you would be without your teacher. And you can also contemplate where you would be without teachers in general, right? So even if you didn't have this teacher, what if there were no teachers you could find and no traditions? Where you would be if the world didn't have any succession, any paradosis, any transmission of teachings, any musaceae, none of this. Where would you be? Hieratic rites, invocations, meditation, techniques, internal alchemy would all still exist. But what if there was no one in the entire world to teach it? Where would you be? What if there was someone to teach you the first step? What if there was someone to teach you 50% of the way? What if there was someone to teach you 90% of the way and no one for the last 10? Think about that kind of helplessness you would be in. And suddenly you can realize how utterly helpless and small you are in this grand scheme of countless just titanic masters who have come and incarnated and over the course of lifetimes have developed this system. And some of these things didn't even come from the masters, right? They came straight from the heavens. They came straight from gods and spirits, greater human intelligences. It's important to contemplate these things. And another good thing to contemplate, I think kind of the root essence of the whole thing, which the lecture touches on, is contemplating humility. Sitting there and just diving deeper and deeper and deeper into it. Just make yourself feel as absolutely small as possible. And at first you might think that doing this will cause you to feel unnecessarily small, unnecessarily helpless, right? It might cause you to feel weak. But if you see it through to the complete end, right? Like there's this teaching, Yang gives birth to Yin and Yin gives birth to Yang, right? Like if you see it through to the absolute end, it can actually empower you. And you'll see what I mean if you actually practice this. Sit there and just contemplate to yourself. Hey, can you use the other door?
It's locked.
I'll unlock it. 1 second, guys. Contemplate what it means to have this kind of absolute humility. So you sit there and you really think about how small you are. Think about the vastness of the universe. Think about the nature of the universe. The rising and the setting of the sun, the fixed and movable stars, right? Think about these vaster things and then think about smaller things as well. Think about society, culture, the transmission of teachings, souls. Think about all these things and think about how absolutely small in comparison to them you are. Think about your greatest concept of spiritual attainment, having achieved gnosis, having achieved the body of light. And still how utterly small someone at that level is in the grand scheme of things. All right, someone can be wildly enlightened. Someone can be walking around claiming to be this brilliant master, and he has a million disciples, and he's able to levitate when he meditates, and he's able to enter into these wonderful states of awareness and consciousness where he becomes God and he says, I'm God. And like I mentioned before, Ramos and I joked, sometimes it's as simple as holding up some fingers behind your back and saying, how many fingers am I holding up? And there are some people that would easily be able to tell you that, and there are some masters, like I just described, who wouldn't know the answer because they don't have that particular siddhi that would be required, right? So, it's interesting, you can get caught up even in the higher states, especially in the higher states, as thinking of yourself as being God. Because, and I've talked about this before, when you experience those higher states, you're just getting the tiniest drop of divinity. But in comparison to how small you are, that tiniest drop is like a universe to you. It's like comparing a drop of water, which is just, it seems so small, right? Especially in the scale of the universe, a piece of water is like infinitesimally small. But compare that drop of water to a piece of bacteria, right? To like a single-celled organism, and imagine dropping that water on it. It would obliterate its entire concept of existence, right? If it was cognizant of what had just happened. And this is what entering into these higher states is like. You get this drop, and it blows your mind, and you think you must be divinity itself, when in reality you're experiencing virtually nothing. So it's important to dive deeper and deeper and really think, where would I be if there were no teachers? Where would I be if there was no internal alchemy? Where would I be if there was no Sarah that God created? Right? Think about all these different things and truly humble yourself and realize, honestly, it's the same thing, that you can think about your life. Where would I be if I wasn't with, if you don't like your wife, where would I be if I wasn't with this wife who's always holding me back? But if you really sit down and contemplate and think, you can find that wife is probably really a blessing, and that you couldn't have made better decisions in life, and that you're really not that hot and that awesome, and that you're lucky to be with someone that attractive and someone that's managed to stick with you for that long, because you're probably kind of a difficult person to be with. So if they're even willing to be with you for this long, then you should be touching their feet, right? So like contemplate, dive into this state of humility. And it can actually start to empower you, because now all of a sudden you will be filled with gratefulness. And you realize, my goodness, I'm this small and yet I have so much. And how fortunate am I that even a small drop of God makes me feel this amazing. And yet there's an infinite vastness beyond for me to experience. An endless field of growth that lies before me, of constantly becoming happier and more divine. And all of a sudden, as you've realized yourself to be so small, there's a reaction that occurs where yin gives birth to yang, and it starts to empower you. They have a concept of this in Sufism. It's not so much a contemplation of humility, but in a way it is. It's when you're doing your prayers and you're entering into your gnostic states, and in your gnosis you're expanding more and more into vaster and vaster states, feeling like you're more and more God, becoming vaster and more infinite, until you feel like you're the most infinite, the most omnipresent and omniscient and omnipotent. You're this vast, boundless, eternal being. And then you finally reach one step higher, and you get a glimpse of God. And as soon as you have a glimpse of God and you realize God's vastness, it makes you realize how absolutely small you are. You're growing and growing and growing, and then it's like an ant who thinks he's the biggest ant around, looking up and seeing the Eiffel Tower. Instantly, it shrinks you down. And then you start shrinking more and more and more, realizing how absolutely small you are in comparison to Godhead. And you shrink and you shrink and you shrink more and more and more, until you can't shrink anymore, until you become so humble that you start to receive more light, that your humility opens up another level for you. And then the process repeats. You start expanding and then contracting and expanding and contracting. So try to perform some of these contemplations when you sit down to meditate. Actually dedicate a nice 30-minute session to really contemplating humility in this way. So that's one assignment. And then there's one more assignment as well. So that's the first assignment. And that's one to practice while you're sitting down, eyes closed. Another one you can practice is another contemplation that I want you to practice just throughout the day, throughout the week. I just want you to think about these things. And it's the 4 defects. All right, so we have this doctrine of the creator and the kantharos. So one is the vessel which holds the wine. and the other is the vessel which receives it, right? So all the wine is poured into this large vessel, and then everyone has their smaller cups, which that vessel fills. So Dionysos is depicted as holding the crater, and we're all depicted holding a cantharos. Or it's vice versa. But this doctrine just kind of paints a picture of these 4 different states that a student can be in, and these 4 different defects, right? And you can also kind of relegate them to the elements as well, because you can say that there's 5 cups, and the 5th one is as perfect as you get, right? So all the cups have a little bit of water in them, because water is always almost always put within the cups to dilute the wine so that the wine would last longer. And so this is why Dionysus is called the giver of unmixed wine. It's a metaphor that Dionysus's wine is the strongest because he doesn't dilute it. But in this analogy, we're all depicted as holding cups with a little bit of wine in them, or a little bit of water in them. And that little bit of water just represents the transmission of teachings and your own ego. That no matter how pure you are, no matter how well the teachings are transmitted, there's a little bit of essence lost in the transmission. And so the teachings become a little bit diluted as they're handed down from teacher to student, which is why it's important that masters incarnate every few generations to breathe fresh life back into the lineage. And a kind of revival occurs where then for the next usually 2 generations, everyone's achieving the highest states, and there's like this revival that happens, and then it slowly starts to die down a little bit until that happens again. This is common, you can see throughout different lineages in history. So that's what the water represents. And so like the perfect cup would be this 5th one, which is the spirit principle, right? And it would represent just a nice, well-formed cup face up with a little bit of water in it. That's like the best you can be. And then there are 4 variations of this. And all of us have at least one of these variations, but honestly, all of us have all of them to some degree or another. So really, when you say that you have like this one main defect, it just means that that's the one you struggle with the most, but certainly you have some form of the other 3 as well. So the first one is the worst in a sense. Really, I would say the first one is the worst, and that's the one that's filled with a little bit of poison. Right, so you can imagine this cup is filled with water, but it's also filled with some other kind of material which is toxic. So when you pour the wine into it and then you drink it, it poisons you and it harms you. The next one, the cup has a little bit of water in it, but the cup also has a crack in it. And so when you pour the wine into it, over time, it slowly begins to leak. The next one, and this is probably the second worst one, is that the cup is actually upside down. So when you try to pour wine into it, the wine splashes over the bottom of the cup and cannot fill the cup. And then the last one, the 4th one, the cup is misshapen. So it's standing, but very weakly. And as soon as you begin to pour wine into it, it begins to wobble and eventually falls over onto its side. It keeps a little bit of wine, but it also makes a mess. So these are the 4 different ways in which a cup can be imagined, and they represent the 4 different ways that a student can receive the teachings. This is briefly alluded to in the lecture, but it's not gone into in detail. So I'm telling it to you all now because there are these 2 assignments, right? The first assignment is to perform that first initial contemplation on humility, and you should perform it in regards to your life, and you should also perform it in regards to studentship, being a good student on the spiritual path, both in this school and in the spiritual path as a whole throughout your life, what it means to truly be a good student. So I want you to do it once for your life, sit down for a good 30 minutes at least, and then again I want you to do it on a separate sitting just on the spiritual path itself, both in the school and outside the school, yourself as a student to the mysteries. And I want you to really dive through it, and ultimately that's something you could do a few times if you really want to receive the benefit. Obviously it's something you should be doing periodically for your whole life. So the next, the other assignment is this one on the crater and the cantharos, and I've only given you the symbolism of it. I haven't given you the explanation because I want you to think about it throughout the week. and contemplate what you think all those different things mean for the student. And then once you've figured them out as far as you can, post them into Slack, and there can be some discussion on it. And then eventually, once everyone comes to the proper conclusions regarding them all, it shouldn't be too hard. It's very simple. Then I want you to spend time throughout your day and throughout your week contemplating those things within yourself. Which ones you struggle with the most? Which ones you're mentally avoiding because you're afraid to admit that you struggle with them the most? Right? Think about things like that. It's easy to think that you're a pretty good student, that you're humble, and you can think, oh yeah, but I mean, I love the teachers, and I love this school. I don't really have too much trouble with like my pride getting in the way. But there's so much there that you can harvest. There's so much there you can harvest in terms of humility. And you'll only realize that if you actually do it. All right, so that's it today. Another quick video lecture, but I hope that you all actually take these things to heart and use them in your day and in your practice. All right, God bless.